You know, let's not, we should be all done with that now. And so the reenactments prevent that from happening. And I think it may be also the only way that we continue to prevent it from recurring. That we reenact this and show the savagery and the reality. And yeah, it's prickly and it's hard to see. And I don't think we can get in touch with it without seeing that. I feel like the directors were empowered. I think the reenactments are important. And maybe someday someone will reinvestigate with some new technology and we'll figure out how this came to pass.
I want to add to something and pick off something that Harvey said about conversation after this. I think it's good to have the reenactments, but without a conversation after that about how to change, the reenactments are only going to fester the wounds and teach the same savagery to the next generation.
I wanted to make one other quick contrast. The whole Beast Fest, well, that can go on and on every year. Beast Fest is a great time, but how about the reality of what we're dealing with right now? Because it's real world. It might be history, but it's still, it's.
Yeah, in line with what you said, James, they mentioned at least twice that there were very few residents of that town who attended those. So is it becoming a tourist attraction and not a learning device for the people who are probably allegedly responsible for this boy's murder?
Hand right here.
Here.
Oh, right there.
I think that we never hear the phrase or the approach truth and reconciliation as separate, and you can't have reconciliation without truth, but I also think it is a place of privilege to see truth that others may have known for so long and not be triggered by that truth. So I understand people who are still living a cycle of historical trauma thinking that it's inappropriate, and that for those of us who are enraged and who think that it's very meaningful, and we all are going to sit on a different part of the spectrum, our ability to watch it may be based in our own distance from that historical trauma in some cases, and I think that's a completely valid emotional response from some people.
You got a hand right here.
Thank you. I think that it's so layered and it's not gone. And it's why, people are kneeling at football games just because it's not gone. And there's an arm of law enforcement that still remains involved in the suppression and the oppression of people of color. And this is, it's still doing what it was meant to do, which is frighten, keep people quiet. I just read recently there are 18 states that are trying to outlaw protest. We have a dialogue that is, we're all fractured, and that we should stop arguing with each other. That we shouldn't, now with that, to me, we're loaded with code words. That means you can't have a rousing discussion either, because somebody will say, stop attacking each other. So, it's what we call it. And we saw, ever since Nixon probably, or Reagan for sure, we've had these code words and dog whistles. We've had the rallies down in the heart of Mississippi where my family is from. We changed, the Democrats to Dixiecrats who really operate as people who want to oppress people of color. I really like what you brought out about money, because the moneyed interests do better when you're at each other's throats. And all throughout history, Skip Gates' Reconstruction on PBS pointed this out again, which is as soon as we become economically liable, the people who really control us economically start using journalism as a dialogue to separate us, make us fearful of the other taking what we have. So to me, our only way is to talk to each other. And that means kind of like what happens in an election year, you're canvassing. You're going, why not just bring up groups that get to talk about this stuff on a regular basis with your neighbors? There's a guy across the street from me in Pembroke that's got a rebel flag hanging in his garage, and he likes to keep it open to show everybody. So, and so language, I think, can change, and talking to each other is the remedy. Stop listening to others who aren't involved in the community, who don't know what they're talking about. Stop listening to people who've never known a black person tell you how it is for black people. It's not gonna work. It's just, but vice versa also. You know, white people ought to be able to talk about what they don't know and not get stomped all over. In high school, I created a dialogue that says, okay, you can touch my hair. If you stand there and let me tell you about the difference between my hair and your hair, and let me tell you don't leave here and don't touch black people's hair because you might get hurt, you know. But so we have to make room for learning about each other. The last thing I want to say is I think that we have to dispel the myth. There isn't a thing called race. We're the human race, and that's been created by the powers that be to let us think that one race is superior to the other. And what we need to do is start talking about white supremacy, or supremacy itself, because it exists in all of our groups. Educated blacks talking about ghetto blacks. Do you hear me? People who've been in this country for 5 years longer than their immigrant relatives, talking about somebody who just got off the boat. We have to stop that. Really look at what we're doing when we hold ourselves above each other. My father worked in civil rights in Mississippi. He was sent back to the service because he was, you know, working with the NAACP and voter rights and everything in Vicksburg. And they called him back to the service because they wanted to get him out of the community. But so what we need to do is really change our language and call it what it is and let people realize that we have the same interests.
So if I can add to that, for me, it's the discussion about white supremacy is important. There are two concepts I think we should all understand before we even get to that discussion. First concept is we all need to have what Dr. Carol Dweck calls a growth mindset. Anybody heard of that concept before? The growth mindset that says you need to be willing to embrace change and the learning rather than being fearful of change. If you don't have a great growth mindset, you're not going to change to begin with. Second concept is unconscious implicit bias. And there's some folks who I was just doing a presentation for this last Sunday. We are all implicitly biased. And it's that implicit bias that causes microaggressions and unkind and unjust behavior. So until we recognize that, and we recognize that physiologically our brains are wired to be biased, we're not going to get anywhere. We're not going to get to the discussion on white supremacy is not going to make sense. It's not going to go anywhere.
I think we can have more than one conversation at once.
Well, yes, we can.
And all of that, I totally agree. Except, when are we gonna do something? I just am sick and tired of meetings and meetings and meetings and praying and praying and praying and singing and singing and singing and marching and marching and marching and doing nothing. We have to do something. And I think, actually, I'll just say this, and my daughter's looking at me, she said, you know what she said? You know what? Too much, Dad. Well, I have the mic, and I'm a politician, so I'm not going to shut up. No, I am going to shut up. But anyway, I can't tell you how many times I've run and hidden from the police in Birmingham, Alabama, to keep from being beaten or shot. When I went there to vote after Korea, I walked into the registrar's office and said, may I vote? I don't know whatever I said. The guy said, you count the number of beads in this jar, and I can tell you how many you can vote. Well, you know, any smart person would know that whatever you said would be wrong.
Right.
He had a gun as big as I was, I turned around and left, and, that's why I'm still here today, but we got to get some investment in this country. We need to own some automobile companies. That's where we spend most of our money. We buy all kinds of big, beautiful cars, and we all want a house, and we have no mortgage companies, no banking companies. What are we doing except praying and begging? Please, let's do something.
Can I just make a quick comment, and I know you're going next, but
You were saying we. I just want to throw out there, and for you to consider and disagree, but I think the we has to be people who have agency. I was struck, one of the scenes that I was struck by in this film was when the guy, I can't remember, said, as a son of the South, it is my responsibility to make sure this doesn't happen again. I think the people who are of a dominant social identity or who have power have the responsibility. It's not just everybody. I think people who have the power to make the change need to stand up and make the change, whether that's, gender, sexual orientation, race. If you're on the powerful side of that dividend, you need to be the one stepping up, not the other side.
Because they don't hand it to you.
Correct.
They don't give you a mortgage.
In the Holocaust, 6 million Jews were killed. What we're talking about and what we see in this film is comparable to that. Maybe over a longer period of time, but it's comparable. It's a matter of genocide. People may not realize, as a result of the Holocaust, Germany paid reparations to Israel. What's eventually going to happen is the same thing in this country, reparations. You want an action? That's an action to take. There's even a bill in Congress to support it. The average black family has something like 1/10 of the wealth of the average white family. That's ultimately as a result of the oppression of black people over the centuries. Reparations won't fix that, but it might bring a kind of closure to it.
So I'm going to say that this is not a solve everything, but Black Heritage Trail of New Hampshire is working on trying to get the history, Black history, and history of civil rights movement in the school system in New Hampshire, which is, according to Southern Poverty Law Center from, I believe it was 3 years ago, the report is they're 48 out of 50 states, so they're at the bottom of the list. And the other thing we're doing is we're trying to educate the general public that's willing to listen and come on tours and expose them to the hidden history of New Hampshire, because I think in order to go forward, to make a wrong right, first you have to acknowledge the wrong, then you have to apologize, then we can move on to hopefully reparations. So, and one last thing, New Hampshire also does have disproportionate minority contact, which means compared to the population, the number of people of color that get stopped in New Hampshire is out of sync. But there is people working on that as well. They have been going around and giving the police departments training on that, so that, and the studies show that once they get the training, that number tends to go down. And one of the things they did do is train the police academy so that as the new policemen are coming through, they get that training as well. So there are some things going on that are going in the positive direction.
Is that cross-cultural training?
Yes.
Good.
But it's still, you're more hours are required to be a hairdresser than law enforcement.
To say it, like, because he can't hear.
On average, you're required more hours of training to become a hairdresser than law enforcement.
Which
Hours.
the state of New Hampshire requires no texture type 4 hair type in its training.
Oh.
Say that again.
New Hampshire does not
That's
New
require.
Hampshire does not require any texture 4
Hairdresser.
training
Yeah.
in its certification.
Oh.
Just an FYI.
I thought you were talking about cops.
One is as hopeful. I have kids that are 14 through 18. And I learn from them because they don't seem to be enamored by the culture that I grew up in. They're a little bit more open with their feelings and their dialogue. What would be accepted to them, I may have been quiet when I was their age, but they're out there. And I do also think that the open dialogue of being curious and being compassionate when having a difficult conversation about this is essential. And if we can have and continue to have that intellectual, curious, but respectful conversation, I think we move forward.
So I think that's a really good point about having the conversations, and there's a book called Having Difficult Conversations by, forgetting the authors now, but it talks about the fact that in every difficult conversation, there are actually 3 conversations going on. One conversation about the actual facts of the matter, one conversation about emotions that the situation stirs, and another conversation about the identity of the person who may have said something offensive. Am I worthy of anything because I just said something that offended someone or that someone disagreed with? So we need to understand that there are those 3 conversations and work through those as we have these difficult conversations about race.
Hi. I was really struck by the power of fear that was shown in this movie, and kind of the complicit silence of people. So at one point there was a reward sign that went up for $15,000 back in the, was that in the 40s or the 50s, and I thought what fear people must have had to not come forward and speak about what they knew. And then when the family moved away in the dark of night, you know, it implied that there were other people that knew what was happening, you know, what had happened to Lennon. And I just think that, you know, we have to tap into our own courage and really find a way to help our communities confront that fear and to speak up. And that was one of the lessons I took away from the movie.
Sarah's got one down.
I'm from Mississippi also, 40 years ago, and the thing that horrified me was the normalization and the party atmosphere, the normalization of the terrorism. And last year, reading about Cindy Hyde-Smith, who is a senator in Mississippi, and actually made a comment about I'd go to a lynching with that guy. And so I think the thing that horrified